It is day one of painting the wilderness, and I am so excited to get started with you. We're going to jump right in to a beautiful watercolor night sky. Hello, my friend. I am so glad you're here because we are going to have so much fun painting a watercolor night sky. So for this watercolor night sky, I'm going to be using various blues and that white gouache. I'll be using all three of those brushes, a round size 10, a round size 6, and a round size 2. And it's also really helpful especially if you're using a watercolor journal like I'm using. That's my Wonder Forest watercolor journal. It's helpful to get started by taping down your paper. So I'm using washi tape and I'm leaving the ends extra long so that I can wrap my washi tape around the notebook. And in order to keep the paper even more taut, I am putting a couple binder clips just in the middle to help keep that top page taut with the other pages, kind of making a makeshift watercolor block. So now I'm going to get started. This night sky will be completed in layers. We're going to have a few different layers for the sky and then complete the sky with a layer of trees silhouetted against the sky. The first few layers of the sky will be utilizing the wet on wet technique, which is why I got my whole page wet with clean water before we started. So I'm going to use phthalo blue here. It's phthalo blue green shade or Winsor blue if you're using Winsor & Newton paint. And I'm getting it wet so that it makes the paint a little bit lighter. As you can see, I put some of that paint on my little diamond palette there and put some extra water on it before I started painting because phthalo blue can be really intense. And I want to start light and then get darker progressively. The reason we start light and then get darker with watercolor is because it is a lot harder to make something light if you've made it too dark. So if you start dark and then if you start light and then get darker, that will kind of help you build the contrast and maintain those glimmering white spots. So as you can probably also see, I am just kind of blobbing down the paint in random little pockets. But in order to create the contrast of the lighter parts of the sky with the darker parts, I'm intentionally leaving behind some pockets of white or light space. And the way that I'm doing that with the wet on wet technique is alternating between painting with paint and then washing off my brush and just painting with clean water. When I want to maintain some light spaces, especially if I'm trying to maybe push away some of the paint to keep the spaces light, painting with clean water can be very helpful. So that is the first layer. I just kind of went until I was done, let it dry all the way, and now I'm going to paint the second layer of the sky after the first layer is already dry completely. We do 2 layers, one layer and then let it dry and then another to create depth and to help the vibrance of the painting. Because if we try to do this all in one layer, it's possible, but all of the water that you would use would kind of dilute the paint and maybe make it a little trickier to get the dark of the Payne's Gray. So as you can see here, I'm using Payne's Gray on top for this second layer to contrast against the light of the phthalo blue that I was using. I'm using the same technique that I did before, which is I am sometimes painting with really dark and intense pigment, and other times I'm washing off my brush and just using water to kind of blend the pigment into the sky. Now, I'm not looking for really seamless blends here. I want it to be kind of random and not perfect by any means, just a little bit watercolory and cloudy so that there is a clear, distinct, but beautiful difference between the dark of the sky and the light parts in the middle. So the key here really is to make sure you leave behind pockets of white. That helps to create a luminous effect, meaning it looks like there's light, glimmering in the sky. So next we're using white gouache. This layer has not quite dried yet. I like to do one layer of stars, meaning I add a little bit of water to my gouache and then I splatter my paintbrush. I like to do one layer while my painting is still just a little wet so that some of the stars blend into the wet and create kind of a glimmer shining effect. And then I let that dry and I do another layer of splattered stars using gouache. Now, if you don't have gouache, you can use a white gel pen to create the stars. You can just draw them in manually. If you do that, just make sure to kind of paint the stars in clusters and intentionally make them look random. You'll find it's very difficult, which is why I usually splatter stars. Your mind will want to put them into a pattern, but that doesn't look realistic because nature actually is very chaotic. And so that's why I really love to splatter. But if you're using a white gel pen, just try to intentionally add in that randomness. Now I'm going to finish off the sky with a shooting star. If you remember the rule of thirds, which was in an explainer video that I posted last week, the link to that video is in the description. I put the star on in the top corner because that is a really pleasing place according to the rule of thirds. So now I've let the sky dry completely. And I'm going to finish by painting a really dark silhouette of trees. I'm using Payne's Gray here. I'm using very, very pigmented Payne's Gray, so it's mostly pigment and just a little bit of water so that I can activate it. And I'm using a technique called scumbling. Scumbling basically just means you're painting random blobs across the page. I like to think of scumbling as like you're making your paintbrush dance in a really kind of random movement so that you can create a little bit of chaos, right? And so the whole point of scumbling is that I'm not intentionally doing anything, really. I'm just kind of moving my hand back and forth in order to create this wall of blobs. I am intentionally leaving behind little pockets of dry space so that I can maintain some texture, and so it's not just like one big wall of blue. I do want some little pockets of dry space. And now that I've kind of, covered that half of the sky, I'm adding along the edge some kind of sharp little points. These are small details that will help your eye, help your mind recognize that wall of blobs as foliage. So that's also why we left behind those little pockets of dry space. When you have those little details, especially when using the scumbling technique or, trying to just make random blobs and shape them into something more, tiny details make all of the difference. And so that's what I did with my paintbrush there. Along the edges, I just, tried to make it look like there were sticks or branches or tiny leaves poking out. So that looked more like a wall of foliage. And I'm done. I think it looks so cool. I'm going to take off the washi tape now. For this painting, some of the paper lifted when I lifted the washi tape. That happens. Sometimes it's because of the paper, sometimes it's because of the tape. You'll find that, you'll get different results depending on what you use. But because this isn't a watercolor journal and I'm just painting for fun, I don't really mind so much that some of the paper has lifted up. Now I'm going to sign my painting because I think it's always a really fun thing to kind of put your mark. And wow, look at that amazing luminous glimmering effect that we got. As a reminder, that kind of luminous effect where the light is contrasting against the dark is because we used the wet on wet technique to ensure that the light spaces stayed light, and we used some very, very dark paint so that there's a lot of contrast between the light and the dark, and it just looks magical. So now that I've painted this night sky for day one of painting the wilderness, I'm going to do a process that I find incredibly helpful, especially as you are just learning. Because as you're painting along with me, you might have realized your painting didn't turn out like mine did, or it didn't turn out like you expected. And it can be really easy to kind of get down on yourself for that. But it's so important to have self compassion and to think about what you loved. So I'm going to challenge you to think about 3 things that you loved about your painting. Some things that I loved about my painting are the color blends, I loved the contrast that I got, and I really loved the stars. And now, instead of thinking about how you failed, think about what you learned. I think that I learned scumbling takes some practice. Little details matter a lot. Kind of building layers can be helpful when you're painting night skies like this. And I said straight lines are hard because I think the shooting star was just a little crooked there. So I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that you loved this tutorial. If you want a chance at winning a copy of my book, please leave a comment down below, and I will see you next time.